Hi, I'm Clara, and this is the Practice with Clara podcast, where we go into philosophy and all things yoga related, which has been my passion for the last 20 years. In today's episode, we answered questions from the 30 Opportunities Yoga Challenge that we're wrapping up this week. We answered some of the questions that came up, which were the difference between stability and mobility in yoga poses and yoga bodies. We defined what self-care was, and if you're new to yoga, what should you study first? We hope you enjoyed today's episode, and if you haven't already, subscribe to the podcast.
Welcome, everyone, to the Practice with Clara podcast. You're sitting with Stephanie.
I'm Clara.
For our chat this week on fire. And we are, this is a great theme for our final week of the 30-day challenge.
Yep,
It ends in 2 days. We made it through the month. Clara, how was it for you? Let's just go with that.
Yeah, that's a good question. It was so interesting because I haven't done a 30-day challenge in probably, I would say like 5 years. And I have a different life now. And so when I could make it to the mat, I did. And it's so interesting because I personally, before I was a parent, would practice the first thing in the morning. And that's just not the case right now. So we would practice last thing at night. And so that was a very different, it was interesting. It was interesting to do yoga at night, like when it's dark out and we just ate dinner or whatever.
And have the motivation to, because if it's dark too, I'd be like, meh, maybe we don't do it today.
Yeah, there was definitely one class where we ate dinner and watched the class.
I remember you wrote it. You were like, we had pizza.
Yeah, I was like, we were starving and it took that long for our baby to go down. So, c'est la vie. But I loved it and it was so nice to come back to the mat and it was interesting to take my own classes for 30 days. And so, I'm thankful. How about you?
Yeah, it was interesting doing it online because I don't think I've ever done a 30-day challenge online. I've signed up for them but haven't done them just because it lacked, everything was through email. So there was no really way to stay accountable and connected with others, which is a big part of staying in the challenge for the full duration is having the community. So it was nice having the Facebook group as a touch point because I don't know if I would have made it through. Well, I haven't in the past.
Yeah.
Lots came up. I'd say fire is a good way to kind of ground in the theme for the 30 days, just with how nice out it's been, and I got to practice outside. And connecting to your inner fire and discipline to stick with it, because I needed that a couple times.
Same. And also the other part about that is also being forgiving, at least for myself, when I wasn't able to make it. There were definitely a couple of days where we just, by the time our baby went down, it was like 10:30, and it's like, at this point I need to shower. I still have I have regular life to do. So it was also important for me to work on forgiveness for myself for not making it sometimes, and sometimes the yoga is forgiveness.
Yep.
So that was a good learning for us.
And I feel like part of the reason I probably also could commit and stay in this is because of how you paced the classes. Because by Friday, you're a little bit whipped. But because you offered mantra or meditation or a slower class, I looked forward to Friday. Instead of having that dread that starts to accumulate where you're like, oh, my legs are sore.
Yes.
I did this yesterday. Like maybe you're anxious and you don't want to sit down. I hit all of those points.
Yeah.
But Friday for me was always a moment to look forward to because I knew it was going to be super gentle, not a very long practice, maybe 10-15 minutes.
Yeah.
So it was great. Friday was a really good day for me.
And what I loved that some people actually did on the Facebook group is they actually personalized it. So they would look at the week. They would look at the week in terms of the schedule of the classes, and then they would look at their own schedule. And some people actually moved the classes around, which I thought was so perfect because, again, why we did such a variety of classes is we show up feeling differently every single day. So I wanted to kind of anticipate that to the best of my ability, obviously, of how I would be feeling 15 days in or what have you. But in the same breath, it was like amazing that people looked ahead and was like, actually, I did, day 15 on day 13, and I moved things around, still sticking with doing yoga every day, but just personalizing it for their own life, which I think is amazing. And that, I would say, is the gift of the virtual 30-day challenge, because I've never done one either. Online, I've only ever done them at the studio. So I love that. And what's cool about that, and not cool at the same time, is that you know what kind of class. Like I had labeled them like leg, arm balances or whatever like that. So you had a sense. And so, yeah, you could kind of pace yourself and know how to take care of yourself throughout the week, which I loved.
Yeah, and get there when you could, because I've done 30-day challenges through a studio, which has its bonuses of coming together with people in a shared space, but also timing of getting to that place can sometimes be a deterrent. When it's online, you just roll out your mat whenever serves. If it's 10:30 at night after your baby goes to bed and you've ordered pizza, or
Exactly. You do it when you can. And that was the perfect thing. Though I miss being in community. I mean, it was Alejandro and I, so we had our mini community. But the community online was so active and so amazing. So thank you to all of those who participated in the Facebook discussion. It was awesome.
And one of the things that I loved about the Facebook group is, because I practice later in the day, it's when my body likes to move and it's more cleansing. But I would read people's comments just out of curiosity to see what people are sitting with. And one of the classes, because usually Claire has playlists with the class, but I usually do it just the words and would listen to the ocean or the wind.
Yeah, so the sidebar that is that the playlists are on Spotify. So all the classes that are on the site are just my voice, and then you have the option if you want to have a playlist with them. So that's what Steph's talking about right now. So, but you have to go get the playlist and access it. So. Yeah, so you were just listening to just the voice and no playlist.
Yeah, but then there was one class specifically where everyone was writing about how dope that day's playlist was, and it totally was. So I went and listened to the playlist and added it, but you could kind of get a feel of what was going on with everyone and what was in the class based on the feedback that people were sharing, which was so cool to be in that scene, because you can kind of like, oh, what's in the class, what are people sitting with, and also through the journaling prompts, because you offered a journaling prompt with every class. There were 2 times where I myself was sitting with like just lethargy, heaviness, wasn't feeling myself that day. And then the feedback that came out around that, it's cool witnessing like I'm not alone. Sometimes the energetic current, it's not just something you're carrying, it's bigger than you, and everyone's feeling the same thing, which is interesting in the virtual challenge because I don't think you would have that intimacy. I haven't in a yoga challenge in a studio. You walk in, you do the class, you listen to the teacher, you leave. You're not going to dish with the entire room.
And just kind of building on that, the time that we usually hear about as teachers, the feedback in terms of that would be at the end of the challenge, we usually have a closing circle at the studios. And so I've been having one virtually every single day. And so one thing that I'll say is also really cool as a teacher is that we also give the space for people to ask questions. And so there were some really great questions, anatomical questions and sequencing questions that came up that I was able to answer right away on the page, which generally doesn't happen because usually people just leave, like you said, afterwards. Yeah. So it's nice. It was nice to get feedback in terms of how the classes felt in people's bodies, and then B, I really enjoyed that people asked questions, and then I was able to answer them. So that's cool.
And that's actually the theme that we're tying into our talk today, just to wrap up the challenge and bring in some of the questions that people brought up, just because they're awesome questions. And it's relevant. We've done the practice. It's in our bodies. So to kind of hash it out and talk about it. So I'll read the first one.
Yes, please.
Clara, your practice has obviously evolved over the years with gained awareness and experience. You mentioned in one of your classes that you did not do hero pose for a while, and you're now adding it back into your personal practice.
So I'm just going to sidebar that because I put 3 classes together in 1 week that all had hero and camel, which are 2 poses that I don't teach a lot of, but some of the classes I had shot maybe about 7 years ago, and then some classes I shot last year. So it was interesting having them like literally. So I'd posted on our discussion page like, how's everybody feeling about the hero to camel? Because I generally don't teach them, but I brought 3 classes together that have that. That's like the exact sequence.
Day after day.
Yeah, and then the next week was all twisting, which that was definitely on purpose. But anyway, sorry, keep going.
So I'm really interested in the whole topic of this evolution in your practice. What have you come up with in terms of various postures or practices that you would not recommend that seem to be very popular, or vice versa? What did your personal practice reveal about more beneficial elements, and something that we could be doing more of. For example, there's lots of discussion now that pigeon pose could make it worse for you if you have hip problems or tight hips. Totally. Clara also mentioned in the Barcelona class bringing in hip or thigh strengthening elements, as there are not many of these in traditional yoga. Could you please share your views and knowledge based on your experience and this deep understanding?
We could talk about this for like 4 hours. I was like, such a good question.
Such a good question.
I'm going to first just touch on the pigeon because I thought that was a good one. So I don't teach pigeon, actually. I think I teach pigeon once every 6 months in a regular yoga class. I don't teach it anymore. It's actually not, it's not super healthy for the knees because you're in deep flexion and external rotation at the same time. So if you have any knee sensitivity, which is a large part of our population, especially those of us who are over 35/40, it inevitably happens depending upon how much exercise you're doing or sports. Knees are one of the first ones to kind of feel the brunt of intense exertion. So I don't generally teach pigeon pose actually anymore for that reason. I teach thread the needle or double pigeon or cow face because with all of those, generally your knee doesn't go past 90 degrees, so it's not in very deep flexion and it's not in very deep it's in mild flexion with external rotation. So flexion being the bending of the knee, and then external rotation meaning if this was my knee, right, and this is my hip, I'd be going out to the side like that. So that's external rotation. Because knees are just meant to literally extend and flex, right? So that adding that external rotation adds a bit of torque, so it's just not so great. And I learned that through studying a lot of anatomy. But I'll tell you, 15 years ago, everybody I was in every class had pigeon pose.
And what would you say of the hips in pigeon? Is it a hip thing?
Well, so the rule of thumb generally is if you feel pain in your knee, it's something that's going on in your ankle or in your hip. Ankle and hip. I hope you like that this is that my arm has now become my leg. It can be. It can be. So if you have, depending on how tight your glutes are, right, in terms of range of motion, because it's a glute opener, it's a butt opener. And so if your glutes are really, really tight and then you're trying to go into this, then your knee, you won't have as much rotation in the knee because there isn't that flexibility at the top, right?
Yeah.
Meaning where the femur bone connects into the hip. So, so pigeon pose would be one that I don't recommend, especially if you have any knee stuff. People who have generally have had hip replacements and things like that, it's not recommended. They do thread the needle or other things. So.
And playing devil's advocate, because I'm really flexible, I don't feel anything in pigeon pose because of the way. But then when I get into even deer pose,
90-90.
90-90 legs, the angle of my hips is getting into the deeper outer thigh muscles that I don't feel in pigeon because I think my knees are so flexible and I can just drop my pelvis and get in.
Yes.
And I don't feel anything.
Yes.
Versus if I do a lesser pose or thread the needle on my back, I can feel way more.
Yes. And the biggest thing, so the rule of thumb also with people who are very open in their pelvises, which Steph and Clara are both. Sometimes I talk about myself in the third person. You're welcome. Both of us are very open in the pelvis. So if you're very open in the pelvis, then we actually don't want to be opening. We want to be engaging, right? So we would still be doing pigeon pose, but it would be an inner thigh engagement more than, you'd be hugging in and up versus going down. So that's, so something to think of is that those of us who come to the practice with a lot of stability, so those of us who are strong, meaning the muscles are shorter, right, your focus is to do stretching, is to open up those muscles. And then those of us who come to the practice with a lot more mobility, meaning a lot more flexibility, there's a lot more movement in the muscles, then we want to work on strengthening.
Yeah.
Okay?
And less is more.
Yeah.
You've said that before, do less as opposed to going into the deepest.
Yeah, and those of us who are flexible are naturally going to want to go deeper because it feels good. It's our natural range of motion. So we're like, ah! And because of that, at least for me, I've had almost every injury in the book because I went big or I went home, and I generally went home with injuries.
You went home.
Yeah, I went home with injuries. So, so if you're working with a lot of mobility, a lot of flexibility in your body, you actually want to be shortening the poses. You want to be hugging in and up and drawing up, specifically in the inner thighs and the legs. And those of us, again, like I have hyper range of motion in my shoulders, I actually want to go smaller in the movements in terms of my arms, just to protect the girdle itself, the shoulder girdle. So those were, I would say that one of my biggest learnings was that flexibility or mobility, what they call it in PT is like mobility versus stability, right? And how to move or how to do particular poses in order to stay quote unquote safe.
So then that's pigeon. Go into the comment where the writer asked about hero pose.
Yes. Okay. So hero pose, and maybe we'll put a photograph in the write up so that we have it for you guys, so that you're able to, just in case you don't know what hero pose looks like. So hero pose, I pretty much stopped doing it for probably about 5 years in my own body.
Earlier in your practice or
No,
later?
I would say after I shot those pieces in Thailand. So probably about 7 years ago, and I've been practicing for about 20 years, because at that point I was starting to feel a lot of pain in my knees, which I'd never felt before. And then I was talking to some PT friends of mine, and they were like, hero pose is one of the hardest poses because it's deep flexion and internal rotation.
Of your knees.
Yes. Well, it's internal rotation of your thighs, which torques the inner part of your knee.
Yes.
Makes sense?
Yep.
So I stopped doing that pose for probably about 5 years, and I just started bringing it back about a year ago when I was shooting these other classes that I did. And the reason being is I just wanted to give my knees a break. But I think, but that being said, there is an opening in the quadriceps in hero pose that you don't feel in anything else. So now how I generally teach it is that your knees stay hip width apart, they don't touch. So that you're still honoring how wide your pelvis is in terms of what's going on with your knees. It's a lot easier in your knees. When you bring your knees in, it creates a deeper internal rotation of the thighs, which puts more torque in the knee. So hero pose now, generally when I do it, is your knees are hip width apart, or you can offer saddle pose, which is your knees out to the sides, big toes come to touch, and you sit back on your heels, so that you're doing deep flexion in the legs without internal or external rotation of the thighs. So it just protects the inner and outer part of the knee.
And what else? Because you've suggested another pose in lieu of hero pose.
Yes. So the other pose that I recommend because you'll always have, those of us who are teachers, you'll always have somebody in the room that is dealing with some kind of knee stuff, like knee, neck, and lower back are like the three things that generally people are working with in some way, shape, or form. So lizard pose, which is essentially a lunge with your hands on the ground, the inside of the front foot, and then back knee on the ground, and then you stay upright or lower forearms to a blocker of the ground. And what that does is it creates, so the idea of hero pose, it's a quadricep and psoas opener, psoas being the hip flexor, so lizard pose does all that without deep flexion in either of your knees, so it protects your knees. But definitely put padding underneath the back knee would be the one thing I would say.
And just to kind of wrap this question up before we move on, so your feedback would be to assess the two different types of practitioners in the room, and also for yourself identify which you are, if you're the person who's hyper flexible and needs more stability, more strengthening, or if you're the person who's tight and needs the lengthening the space.
Yeah, and so because of that, really listen to the cues that are being offered as the practitioner. Like if you are somebody who's super mobile in your body and they say bend deeper into your front knee or something like that, you might be like, that one's not for me.
Yeah.
So you also want to start discerning, like, is this cue for my body, right? And you can always explore it and then be like, what is the effect of this? And then make a decision based on that. But yeah, I would say the biggest thing is, listen and kind of observe, what am I working with?
And what advice would you give for teachers when they're cueing to the two different bodies?
Oh man, that's a hard one. I have always had this vision that I'd like to have two different yoga classes, one for people who have stability and one for people who have mobility, because the cueing is so different.
Yep.
And so I don't know what to say. The biggest thing is that you look around, and then if you see anybody really going for it in a way that doesn't look stable, that you would go and talk to them and be like, hey, for you, I'd love you to actually draw in and up, or, give them the why. I feel like that's very empowering for the students. Is like, why are we getting them to do this? We're doing this because you're very mobile in your pelvis, or whatever it is. Right?
That's what I was hoping you would say.
Okay.
Because you bring that up in all the trainings I've done with you. You say give the why, so then people who are listening are like, that one's for me, or it's not for me.
Exactly.
I don't need that.
Yeah. So empower. And then the other thing that I would say is another big learning that I've had in my own body, as well as teaching, the last one I'll say is that when I first started teaching my floor series, so the lunar part of class, after you're in the peak pose and done the back bends, my lunar part of class, the cool down, used to be very extensive. I used to go through, because classically you go through twists, hip openers, forward folds, inversion, and then Shavasana, right? What I realized is less is more in everything in life, but specifically in the cool down series is now I usually only teach one or two, or I would say 2 to 5 poses, meaning right and left side, so really just 2 or 3 poses, and hold them for an extended period of time. And the reason being for that is the lunar part of class is to set people up to go into Shavasana, to go into deep relaxation. And so you want to take them out of what we call the sympathetic system into the parasympathetic system. So meaning moving from fight or flight, meaning active, into what we call rest and digest. And so I think the most effective way of doing that is actually doing less, but holding the poses for a lot longer, because it gets people to take it down like 5 notches, so that by the time hopefully they come into Shavasana, they feel very, very relaxed. And how I learned that is actually being in a class where we did 15 poses in the floor series, but held them for like 3 to 5 breaths. And I actually started getting stressed out from how much movement we were doing. And so that was a great indicator for me that I was like, whoa, in my own body, I've noticed I actually need to move less, hold longer, be closer to the ground, so that by the time I get to Shavasana, I'm pretty much like asleep.
And I have a question coupling off of that. How you complement the body in the solar, the active part of class, versus the lunar. So the muscles you're opening in the solar part, what are you doing with them in the lunar part of class?
Great question. One we talk a lot about in the training, so that's why Steph's bringing it up. Good job.
So good.
So for those of us who are not teachers, I'll just say that the kind of teaching, the style of teaching that I teach in Vinyasa Yoga is that we generally always have a peak pose, meaning a pose that we're working towards. And so everything that happens in the solar part of class, meaning the heating part of class, the warm up to the peak pose, is opening up or strengthening the parts of the body that need to be prepared to do this peak pose.
So talk about camel pose. Say that's our peak pose.
Okay, well, I'm almost done.
Okay.
I'm going to come back. Sorry, but I love your style and I know where you're going. So, so that happens, and then what happens in the lunar part of class is that whatever was strengthened, we lengthen in the solar part, in the lunar part of class. So we counter. It's what we call a counter pose, and then the things that were lengthened, we would maybe shorten. So we would strengthen or kind of draw the muscles in. And the pose that I'm going to bring instead of camel pose that I'd like to talk about is Hanuman pose, which is splits, right? So in the splits with one leg forward and one leg back, known as Hanuman pose, right, it involves a lot of hamstring opening, right? You got to do a lot of hamstring being the back of the leg, because your legs are literally spread apart, and your inner thighs are also really need to be opened and also shortened a bit. So how I would counter that in the lunar part of class, which seems a little bit counterintuitive, is I'd actually strengthen the hamstrings. So I would do things like holding bridge pose and lifting one leg off the ground or something like that in order to shorten the muscle that we probably spent the last 25 to 30 minutes opening, right? And the idea of that is just kind of hopefully to come back to a semblance of not a semblance. So how I'm thinking about it is, think of the spectrum of your flexibility, right, versus your stability, meaning how short the muscle can get and how long the muscle can get. And so you walk in, and ideally we're somewhere in the middle, and depending upon what our day was like in terms of that muscle, right? And so if I spend 25 minutes going to one side of the pendulum, one side of the balance sheet, let's say, of opening it, then I need to strengthen it to come back to the middle. So that's the way that I like to think about it, which is a little bit different than I find other classes. And so that's like the mindset that I'm going into in terms of the lunar part of class.
And I feel more connected, complete, centered in a class that does that through the counterposing, where you're working towards one thing, and then I like to think of it like you're closing the gate, like you're saying you're coming back to that midpoint, versus a class where it's either all over the place or it's not complementary. I've actually left classes feeling like just kind of out of sorts with myself, where my body, I don't feel as grounded, or something feels too open, like you feel like you've been blown open and then you're back in the world like, this is way too much right now.
Yeah, I'm like, vulnerable.
Vulnerable is a
Yeah.
good word.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's go to question number 2. I would be interested in going further into the journaling question from the perspective of connecting to giving to myself rather than it just being a routine. I really want to practice self-care in a way that is nourishing and not just surface level.
What do you think she means?
I feel like this is a question around authenticity and being present. So, the journaling question in not just mimicking what everyone else is doing, because what's nourishing for me is going to be different than what's nourishing for you. And also going on autopilot, where now it's like brushing your teeth, where you're doing it because it's the end of the day and you ate food, and it's this sequential order of events that you do without even thinking. Or if you've ever been driving and you're like, oh,
Where am I?
here am I?
How many times have I opened up the fridge and been like, what am I here for?
Yeah, so that is the question here, is how do I make self-care nourishing? The surface level is what's interesting to me in this question, because I don't think connecting to yourself is surface level if you have the self-awareness to ask if it's surface level.
Okay.
And I also feel, last comment on my end, that there's an element, and we talked about this in one of our podcasts, like you want to do something correctly because it's how spirituality is talked about. So like, I'm not going to drink alcohol, or I'm going to get up every morning and meditate for an hour. Like, this is the prescribed way of connecting to myself. But there is no prescription. And that was the point of the 30-day challenge, was to figure out, when do I practice? When do I feel best in my practice? What do I need today on my mat? Keeping it in what we're doing. But it's more about the introspection of, this is where I feel like I'm connecting to myself.
And also, just to kind of build on what you just said in terms of the 30-day challenge, is also, and a lot of people made the comment in the discussion, is that realizing how effective and beneficial it is to show up to your mat regardless of how you feel.
Yes.
Because especially with home practice, it's so easy to be like, I don't feel like doing it today, so I'm not going to do it.
Yep.
And then 15 days go by and you're like, oh, I haven't showed up to my mat or my meditation cushion in 15 days. And so part of the 30-day challenge is to show up regardless of how you feel, and just whatever happens is what happens,
Yeah.
right? But what the question is bringing up beautifully is, the shadow side of that is then sometimes it can literally become rote, meaning that you're not, it's like something that's routine, you're not thinking about it. And so to build on that is, it makes me think of the Rig Veda, which is the oldest of the sacred texts of India. I think it was written down in about 2500 BC. There's this one stanza that talks about that if you just do mantra for the sake of doing it without any intention behind it, you might as well not do it. Yeah. And it's so cool. It's so cool that it was written that long ago, and I'm like, well, still very effective today. Yep, that I understand completely, right? You don't want to just be doing, like they were talking specifically, it was mantra, or they're talking about specifically about doing ritual, a ritual just because that's what you're supposed to do. So you're just kind of moving through the gestures without really thinking about what it is that I'm doing. And I feel like this is what the question is bringing up, is like, how do I do something not just for the sake of doing it, but to have connection through it? And you brought it up perfectly, Steph, is like, how do I stay present when I'm doing whatever it is that I'm doing? And I think that, at least for me, I think self-care, I think sacredness in the mundane, both those things can happen in every single action that you do. Like every action, I think, could be an action of self-care, meaning caring for myself in that moment, regardless of the action that I'm doing. That's why I find it so interesting that we're like, oh, self-care, like take a bath, go for a walk, all good things. I understand, like I joke, but I also fully respect it. But in the same breath, I'm like, I can also do self-care while I'm washing the dishes if I'm like feeling my feet and breathing into my hands, or we can take every opportunity to actually take care of ourselves. We generally don't. I'm one of those people. I'm not trying to say that I'm not, but I do try to strive towards like we can make this, the sacred can show up in the mundane. Like you can be doing your practice with everything that you do, not necessarily every time you show up to the mat. So that's my feeling about it. Yours?
Yeah, I just don't think that it needs to look any certain way. And that's something that I feel this really brought out, the 30-day challenge, because I'm thinking of 2 days for myself, and I've done this in class. There was one day, full intention to show up. I fell asleep in Shavasana.
Great.
But that is self-care, and to me that is being present because it's what my body needed.
Yes.
And then the other time...
And it means that the cool down was really good. Good job, Clara.
Yeah, I was
I'm just teasing.
Oh, I was done. And the other time, and this one was interesting because the journaling question, either the day before or that day, was around listening, really listening to what you need. So I'm doing yoga on the dock, and 2 boaters come up, and they interrupt me, and they start talking to me. And immediately I got so mad because I was like, here I am doing my yoga practice, doing my self-care. I want to reflect. I want to enjoy the sun. I want to meditate. I want to finish stretching my thighs. But then there's this moment where I was like, well, maybe the listening is to these 2 boaters. So I'm like, how can I pivot? How can I be flexible and adapt to the environment, not wanting to totally shut them out?
Yes.
Because that's rude.
Yes.
I'm on a public space,
Yes.
shared space. So I listened to them, and what ended up happening was really interesting. One of the boaters knew my partner, and there was this whole story that came out of it, and then I finished my practice later. No big deal. Like, let it go. Be open to new things.
Yes.
But is that like surface level self-care? Because I wasn't in the intention that was set for the practice through the journaling, through staying. That would never happen in a public class because you're in it in a room. There's no cell phone. There's no other people walking by.
There's cell phones, and there are people walking by sometimes, depending. You know, depending upon the class.
Totally,
So
but
I'm
just thinking
I'm
of
poking
like,
you. I'm
yeah.
poking you. Yes, that's true. Generally, none of those two things.
No, those
Neither of
things aren't happening.
Yeah.
So I think it's just moment to moment, recognizing what am I working with, what is my intention, and this is my work. I can be so rigid, like just open to what is going on around you.
Yes.
But I sway more to the side of overthinking, being rigid. So my practice is the opposite, is being more flexible and fluid. Someone who's more fluid and doesn't have as much discipline,
Yes.
maybe you're the person that's like, no, buddy, you got to go. Like,
Yes.
go to the other dock and talk to people. I need to stay in this.
Yeah.
And I have friends like that who
Absolutely.
discipline is the practice.
Yeah, and self-care is creating that boundary of being like, this is my time.
Totally.
Thank you and no thank you.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So I think it just depends on intention is a great word to bring into it. And I don't think there is any superficial layer. I think as long as you're aware and you're asking those questions, you are going deeper because you have the awareness to ask the question. Right?
Yeah, well, in self-care,
Like, what is self-care? Maybe let's hash that out a little bit.
yeah, so how I was defining it is literally caring for yourself, which means awareness for yourself. And part of the awareness and taking care of yourself is setting boundaries around people,
Yep.
right? Being mindful of what's going on inside of you.
Yep.
And then also your intention of doing whatever it is that you're doing. That's what I would say. That's why I think like I feel like agree about this. Like self-care can look many different ways. It doesn't have to be a bubble bath with a glass of wine. You know, it can be, it doesn't have to be a nature walk. Like self-care could be lying in bed and sleeping for an extra hour or, like listening to music or dancing or whatever it is that takes care of yourself. And the other way that I would define it is like nourishing myself, like feeding myself.
So I have a question for you then. Is self-care a solo act or is it something...
What a great question. What do you think?
Well, I go both ways. I think self-care is like self-soothing. Like if you think of Carvin, where you're like, I want you to figure out how to self-soothe and chill without me so I can kind of take some me time while you're doing you.
Yes.
So in that sense, self-care should be something that you can do by yourself to soothe, to hit, come back to neutral.
Self-soothe is a good one. We were just talking about my baby. That's why Steph's
I bring
bringing
it
it up. But yeah, self-soothing is a good one. I think self-care is self-soothing.
But then, okay.
But you can
cool.
you can soothe with other people.
That's
but I feel like the intention would be that I'm doing this to nourish myself. Because sometimes when we're around other people, we give.
Yeah.
right? And I think that self-care is receiving.
And I think also the awareness in that I can self-soothe. I'm good without you. Like, we've all been in a situation, and maybe we've been that person where you can tell someone really needs you in that moment, where it's having the skills and the coping mechanisms, like, okay, I got this. I'm feeling a lot of things right now. How can I de-escalate and come back to my neutral if I can't call my sister,
Yes.
or I'm not near someone that can help me in that minute? So having things that you do that are self-care for you.
It's usually an action or an event.
Yeah, because it's a demarcation of a thing.
Okay, I feel like we really got that one in.
Yeah. Okay, next question.
Yes.
Number 3. I'm interested in learning processes of more traditional practices. Chakras, elements, a whole vocabulary. This is my first dabbling in a more holistic variety of yoga. At this point, I'm letting these things wash over me, accepting what we're taught in practice and resisting the urge to get too studious and dogmatic. I'm curious if there's a standard curriculum for yoga, or if it varies by type or by region, or what your individual paths were. Essentially, I think just the process of learning is fascinating.
I loved this question.
Yeah, so many things are in it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You want to go first? You want me to go?
You go.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there is no curriculum. There's no curriculum to this practice, which I feel like can be mildly overwhelming because you're like, there's so many.
Yeah.
She brought up so many different concepts. So where do you go? And so what it does, it reminds me of when I was just a practitioner, not teaching yoga. And I remember feeling the same way. Like, my teachers would quote poems or talk about a particular theme, like chakras or whatever, and I had no idea. I felt like I knew it in passing, but not in depth. And so what I found really helpful was to ask my teachers about books that they read. And then like, we have an amazing bookstore here in Vancouver called Banyan Books that has, like, you could probably spend about 15 days there in a row. It's probably one of the coolest new age bookstores I've ever been to in my life. And kind of peruse and see what speaks to you. I've actually done that quite a few times, is like, go and just kind of move, peruse and see what colors of books. Generally it's the cover that gets me, or a title, and then read a little bit of it, and then go home and buy the book and go home and read it. And so I was, at least from the point of view that from my father, who I grew up with, was like, follow your nose in terms of what interests you. There's no right or wrong way to learn, I feel like, about spirituality and concepts of the East. What I think is way more beneficial is move towards something that moves you. Yeah. And so if you hear a quote from somebody, like your teacher or wherever, ask them where it's from, and then get that book and read about it. Or ask them for recommendations. You're like, I kind of want to learn more about chakras, and then they'll give you a couple titles, and you can go into that, or take an online course or whatever. And so the biggest thing I would say is just follow your nose.
Yeah, I'm just, when you were speaking, I was thinking of my own process with the practice, and I took my 200-hour just out of curiosity to learn the language of yoga, and for my own reason of just wanting to perfect my own poses in my own time. So pure ego, that's okay. Got into it with you and Carolyn, and it was helpful to get all the book recommendations and then learn the history of the practice. You guys had us read, I think, the Jivamukti book by Sharon Gannon and David Life.
Heart of Yoga by Jessica Char.
Yeah, I'm sure you could list all the books in that. So that was cool, because then you start getting a little bit of the history of the practice, and then going to teachers and trying new things to just get a feel for what you like. And like Clara's saying, once you know when you enjoy something and the path you want to go on, and it depends on, for me, it depends on the teacher and how they're presenting it, because I thought Kundalini was so frou-frou. I was like, what is this? This is way beyond anything I understand. But then I took a class with Sarah Jade at Dharma Temple, and the way she talked about it and presented it, I was like, man, I can get down with this. This is really interesting.
Yeah. Follow your nose and Yeah, I would say one of the best books to start with would be The Heart of Yoga by Desikachar, because he is the son of Krishnamacharya, who is the forefather of yoga as we know it here in the West. And so, at least for me, it's good to go back to the roots of the kind of yoga, every kind of yoga that we do here in the West, pretty much comes from Krishnamacharya. So to me, that's why I get everybody to read in the 200 hour, the Heart of Yoga, or we get everybody to read The Heart of Yoga, is so that you can understand the roots of where we come from in terms of the lineage itself. And then I get everybody to read the Jivamukti book, because I feel like it is a little bit more accessible, but saying almost pretty much the same thing as The Heart of Yoga, just in a little bit of a different languaging. So I like those two books because people will get different things out of them, because literally the languaging is different. So that's why those two books are the ones that we usually recommend. But there is no right or wrong way, and there's a ton of books.
Another book that comes to mind you guys had us read was the Vanda Scaravelli book. I forget, something about Free the Spine.
Yes, what's it called? Oh, that book is so beautiful. We didn't get you to read that in that. You did that in intensive with me.
Okay.
Yeah, that book is beautiful.
And it's
what's it called?
It's not just yoga, it's art.
Yeah,
there's
that's
photos.
beautiful.
It's so lovely, and there's photos of nature and bodies and Egyptian hieroglyphs where it looks like they're doing wheel and triangle pose. So there's tons of things you can start moving into. And that book, still, I go to it for the quotes and the visuals. And
Yeah,
it's
a
not,
beautiful book.
but she's not even really expressing anything in terms of the philosophy or the religion. It's more around the body and nature. Mm-hmm. So it just depends on the direction you are drawn to. Yeah.
Yeah.
And keep going.
Yes.
Because it's so fun.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And our 300 hour, the book list was like so long, 20
Yes.
books.
Yes.
Yeah.
I love books. Okay, next question.
Last question.
All right.
I would like to know more about chanting, how it affects the brain, the science part, where it originated and in which tradition, and what, Clara, chants are your favorite?
Okay. I'm not a scientist, so let's just start there. So I'm going to tell you what I know, and I'm going to tell you that I'm not a scientist. So my understanding of the mantras, so specifically the mantras of India and the mantras specifically of Sanskrit. So Sanskrit, as with all language, right, we're creating sounds, and those sounds are affecting our body and our minds. We already know that.
Yeah.
Right. So with Sanskrit specifically, they thought of how vibration affects the body. So that particular sounds they figured out affect particular parts of your body, and that's how they correlated a lot of the language, and how they created essentially a lot of the mantras are what I like to call it's almost like a prescription for a particular kind of effect in your body. And so the way that they put these particular sounds together is going to create a particular vibration, which is going to make you feel a particular way. The only science, I mean, there's probably a lot more science backed around this, but the one that I'll bring up is Dr. Emoto, the Japanese doctor who photographed water crystals.
Right.
So he photographed water molecules, and he did this test where he put water in bottles, and then he spoke to them, he sang to them, he played particular music to them, and then he took pictures of the water molecules afterwards, like after 8 hours or 10 hours of being exposed to language or sound or whatever. So there were some bottles of water that he sang to and said loving things to, and the water molecules looked like snowflakes. And then he did other ones where he like cursed at them and was really angry at them, and the water molecules look fractured.
Fractal? No, sharp.
Yeah, they look fragmented.
There we go.
There we go. I was like, it's a frag something. They look fragmented. And so his whole theory around that is that we're made up of 75%, at least 75% water, and so vibration really affects the way that we feel on a molecular level because there's so much water in us.
So cool.
Yeah, so that's all I can say, having not had a science background. Now, that being said, from an experiential point of view, I've definitely had some of my most transcendent experiences by doing mantra.
Yeah.
all of my teachers mantra has been a part of my practice since pretty much the beginning. All of my teachers have done it. And so doing mantra for an extended period of time afterwards, I would feel a particular way. So I definitely believe that mantras have a prescription. Like they make you feel a certain way. In terms of the tradition of it, what I know, and again, I'm also not a historian, so I'll do my best here, is that mantra's been around since the Rig Vedas, so 2500 BC, probably way before that, right? India, as well as I think a lot of places, everything was done orally, right? Everything was passed down orally in terms of traditions, in terms of rituals, that kind of thing. And pretty much all rituals were sung. So I think that it's been around forever. I think since we've started making noises. That's not a scientific. It's not a scientific perspective. That's just a guess. It's a hypothesis. So that's what I know. What do I like about? What are my favorite mantras? I would definitely say the Mahatmrijaya mantra is probably my favorite, which goes Om Triambakam Yajamahe Sugandhim Pushpadinam. We can put that. We'll put that down in the write-up, maybe, if we can. And then the other mantra, which is one of the oldest mantras of India, would be the Gayatri mantra, which is in the Rig Vedas. And I love that mantra. So those two mantras are probably my favorite. And then I also love the Ganesha Om Gan Ganapataye Namaha mantra. I love the way it feels in my mouth. I love the effect it has on my body and on my mind. I really love mantra. And then the last mantra I love is the Asatoma Satgamaya mantra, which is part of a longer invocation. And maybe we can put all of those, we'll put all those in the write-up so that you'll have them. And the way that I even tell people who are new to singing mantra, especially in Sanskrit, is just think of the way that your favorite song makes you feel. Right? It is a particular vibration that is put together that creates a particular feeling in your body. And that's the effect of nada, that's the effect of sound, right? And there's many traditions that just use sound, that just use mantra, like Bhakti yogis are generally, their practice is to just sing, right? They sing to God. Favorite mantras, Steph?
Oh, the Triambakam mantra. And I watched The Matrix again. I shared this with you recently. And the third Matrix in the trilogy ends with the Triambakam mantra, and it blew my mind because I haven't seen The Matrix in like 10 years maybe. So that was so cool to now have the awareness and knowledge of mantra from all the yoga and to make that recognition. And I love The Matrix. It's like one of my favorite trilogies. And I'm going to share a story that I meant to tell you and I forgot. So midway through the challenge, on day 19, you drop the Ganesha mantra, and Ganesha is the remover of obstacles. So on day 18, my mom was sitting with a difficult decision and she didn't know what way to go. And she called me so many times that day asking for advice. And I would be like, Mom, I'm not making this decision for you. Still talking to her, but also kind of like, okay, Deb, figure this out. But she also hadn't done the practice that day. And she was like nervous and she's like, oh, I'm avoiding my mat because I don't want to sit with this decision and all these things. So anyway, evening comes, my mom phones me again. And part of me was like, I do not want to answer this phone call because I'd been counseling my mother with this choice all day and didn't really know what to expect. So I answer the phone and she's like, I did today's practice. I loved it. And she's talking about the mantra. And she's like, I know she made her decision. She had called the person. All these things had shifted in the 4 hours we hadn't spoken. But she'd done the wrong day. It was so wonderful. It was perfect. It was what needed to happen. And I told her and we had a really good laugh. But how cool is that? Because I don't think the movement practice would have shifted what needed to move for her.
Yes.
But she sat with the Ganesha mantra and did it and loved it. She had this whole experience she shared with me. So that's the power of mantra right there. But you don't necessarily feel through the movement. Yeah.
Beautiful. Wonderful way to end.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I'll let you go.
So thank you so much for joining us for today's podcast, Steph. Always a pleasure to be with you.
Yeah.
And those of you that are finishing up the challenge, I think tomorrow is our last day, right? Our last official day. Way to go. Good job. We'll be sending you a survey in the next 24 hours. We'd love you to fill it out. And if you fill out the survey, then you'll be entered into our raffle. And I just wanted to thank again Half Moon for offering some yoga props, Supported Soul, an amazing yoga mat company that's offering a mat. Joy Masks, who is a dear friend of ours who's also doing the practice, she's offering some face masks. And Megan, who's offering some memberships to the site, as well as we're offering some. So if you haven't already, definitely fill out this, or when you see the survey come in through your inbox, go ahead and fill it out, and we'll be doing the raffle on IG. We'll post what time exactly on IG Live.
And if you haven't seen the coupon codes for all of the sponsors are still live until the end of the challenge, and there's 15 to 30% off the products. If you want to go look at the event page on the website and use the coupon codes, I haven't yet, but I keep meaning to. So you have 2 days.
Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Thank you for joining us today on the podcast. Today's podcast is brought to you by the Practice with Clara app. That's mine. I've created almost 100 yoga classes for you to do at home or on the go. And they're available to you on your favorite device, including mobile, desktop, and TV. These classes include Vinyasa, Slow Flow, Hatha, Restorative, Yin, Mantra, Meditation. I also just had a baby, so I created prenatal yoga for all 4 trimesters. So head over to clararobertsoss.com/join to learn more. Or search for the Practice with Clara app at your favorite app store. There's a 7-day free trial, so no commitment. And make sure to subscribe to the podcast. We've got lots of good stuff in store for you. Until next time, namaste.